Oh, good evening, folks. I hope I am both visible and audible. I'm Anirudh Rowjee, and I'm delighted to have been given the opportunity to present this workshop on backend development to you folks today. So, what we'll be covering is we'll be covering Django, which is a web framework, as they say, is a high-level Python web framework that encourages rapid development and clean, pragmatic design. So, if you can just confirm in the comments that I'm clearly visible and audible, and my screen's visible too, we can get started. All right, so I'll just wait a couple more seconds so that the last bunch of people can fill in. We'll get started immediately after that. All right, excellent. My screen is visible. Let me see if I can get my face a little smaller so that we can, have a lot more of the screen visible. Lovely. All right, so my screen is visible at this point. Let's get started with Django then. So, just a tiny bit about me before we move on. This slightly poorly formatted presentation, but I'm Anirudh Rowjee. I am a student of the Computer Science and Engineering batch of 2024 at PESU EC campus. I am a Microsoft Learn student ambassador. I am the core team lead of Hackerspace EC campus, and I am a free and open source software enthusiast. Here are my social media handles at Anirudh Rowjee, and here's my blog where I occasionally write. I'll be on campus in a black color :WQ hoodie. And if you see me on campus, come say hi. I don't bite. So, yeah, this should be fun. Let's get started then. What is Django? So, Django is a high level Python web framework that encourages rapid development and clean, pragmatic design. So, it sounds like a bunch of buzzwords at this point, right? But what it really means is that Django is an extremely easy way for you to build applications with Python and for you to get started in your backend web development journey. Django is what's known as a batteries included framework, in that Django does a lot of things for you that other more minimal frameworks might not do. And in this, Django has its particular strengths, such as the object relational model, which is an excellent experience to use and have take advantage of at scale. And also, it's a very nice way to interact with your objects that you have as well. Okay. So Django functions on what we call a model view controller architecture, which means that all your data resides in what's known as the model, right? All your data models. So when we talk about the backend of a web application, it's the part of the web application you don't see, right? So the backend usually deals with managing data and databases. And your backend also deals with applying your business logic to these different bits of data. So, in Django terminology or in web framework terminology, the model is what we use to describe how the data, exists. So we can say that we've got a string, we've got an integer, we've got a bunch of strings in this object, we've got a bunch of strings in this table. So if you're familiar with what SQL and relational database design is, or relational data modeling is, Django will feel right like home to you, right? So that's covering the model portion of the entire situation. The view. The view is how you as a user or how someone else as an application developer interacts with your backend, right? So the view is something you can configure. It's entirely up to you. So you can use the view to change exactly how people interact, or exactly how either the user interacts with your application, or with how other people who are maybe say subscribing to an API you're building, right? How they interact with your application. Okay. And controller just indicates that you have a lot of control as to how data flows. So you can say that, look, at a specific URL, I want this data to be sent back, right? So how do you know that that data is going to get sent back unless you declare it yourself, right? Which is why it's necessary for a good web framework to have all three. You need to be able to control the model, you need to be able to control the view, and you need to be able to control where the user goes at which specific URL, right? So how we'll be going about this workshop is we'll be building a small URL shortener. So I'm sure many of you have used URL shorteners before, right? Something like bit.ly or bit.ly, if one might say it in a much more concise manner. So we'll be building a very small URL shortener in this workshop. So don't expect something with all like a massive amount of features. Just remember that we're trying to build this project to understand how to write applications in Django. Okay. So we'll be building a small URL shortener. So wherever we put this URL shortener up, if we give it a smaller, slightly smaller segment of the URL, say this XYZ portion here, right? It should be able to redirect us to some long URL. So that's what a URL shortener does. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the functionality of what a URL shortener is. All right. So this is in essence what we'll be building as part of this small workshop that we've got. We'll be building a very small URL shortener. It's a very small full stack app to be able to build. If you want to, you can always add more of the front end later. But the objective of building this is to introduce to you this the specific functionality of Django that makes it such an advantage to know and learn. All right, excellent. So if you're doing this at home, you must have received some information about the prerequisites that you would have needed for this workshop. We will be talking about installing Django at this point. So all you need to do, all right, let me just open up VS Code here. Any IDE of your choice is fine really. So I'll open up VS Code. Here's a slightly small implementation of this project that we've done already to prepare for this workshop. But what we'll be doing is we'll be closing this, all right? We'll be opening a new folder. So go ahead, open VS Code, all right? Let's call this a small URL. All I'm doing is I'm just creating a new folder as to where I want to start this project. And you can open VS Code in that folder or your preferred IDE of choice. You can see that there's your usual, setup of layout that you've got for VS Code. So you've got your Explorer here, you've got your search, you've got your source control, you've got your debugger, you've got extensions, you've got your remote explorer, and there are a bunch of extensions that come in here as well. So if someone in live chat can confirm to me that the screen size, the font size is large enough that people can, even on mobile, can see it easily, we'll move on from there. So just let me know if everything's visible at the right size. All right, now if you haven't gotten VS Code installed before, and if you don't exactly know what this thing at the bottom is, all you'll have to do is you'll have to go to extensions and type in terminal. You'll find this extension, Terminal for Visual Studio Code. Click on this, hit install. I've got it installed already, which is why it says disable. But if you haven't got it installed, this would be the right point of time to install this extension because we'll be using it pretty heavily. Okay, and if you've got git bash or if you've got some familiarity with the Linux command line or with the command line in general, that's excellent too. There's nothing for you to worry about. It's just that we'll be using the VS Code's integrated terminal inside this tutorial to make it a uniform experience for everyone. Of course, if you're comfortable using your own terminal, say you use Linux or Mac OS, if you're comfortable using your own terminal, that's all well and good. Feel free to use that. But for the purposes of this demonstration, I'll be using the terminal extension here from within Visual Studio Code. And if you're on Windows, I suggest that you open up the terminal extension here. And there's a small drop down that's visible here, right? You'll see a bunch of options as to which terminal you can select. Windows users should have an option to select git bash. It just makes things slightly easier at this point if you use git bash. But if you're familiar with the commands to change directories within Windows's native shell, that's excellent too. There's no reason for you to worry. All right. So again, let me just recap the steps as to what I did. All I did was I opened a new folder, right? I opened Visual Studio Code in that folder. I'm assuming all of you have Python 3 installed, because that's pretty important to have, to be able to take part in this tutorial. And if you haven't got it installed, you can go ahead and do so right now. You won't lose out on too much. So just get that installed. And if you haven't already, just hurry up and install it right now. So let me just come back to the slides here. What we'll do is we'll open the terminal. We'll toggle the integrated terminal, right? It should appear something like this. You can see a prompt here where you can type things in. All right. Just to kind of test drive it, we'll type in ls-la, and you should see a bunch of blank output here, indicating that there's nothing as demonstrated by our file explorer here. That there's really nothing inside this directory, right? It's an empty directory. So you can just type this command in to make sure everything's working in the shell, right? At this point of time, what we're going to do is we are going to install Django. Now, Django is a Python framework, but more importantly, it's a library, right? It's packaged and shipped as a library by Python. So if you want to install Django through pip, you can do so. You can do so by doing pip3 install Django. And you can see, because I've already got Django installed, I get a bunch of, requirement already satisfied Django in this path, for multiple libraries that Django depends on as well. So it says requirement already satisfied, but this would be a good time to, go ahead and do pip3 install Django so that you can install it. And once you're done with that, again, this is just a slide detailing the command itself as to what you need to run, right? We'll move on to projects and apps. Now, what really goes on in the background of a Django project is that it's structured in terms of projects and apps, right? So your project can be thought of as the top level organization of a Django app. A project is the topmost level that you'll get in terms of organizing your Django app. So you have different projects for different websites, right? So let's say you're doing a URL shortener. This in itself will be a separate project. And if you have like smaller components inside that, so let's say you have a smaller component inside your URL shortener to maybe handle, multiple objects from a database, or maybe handle one specific bit of functionality. Those constitute apps. The good thing about Django is that apps are pluggable. So you should be in a position to, literally pick up and paste, copy paste essentially one app from one project to another, and it should still work. So that's kind of an idea of the power that Django has in terms of being able to be portable and run in multiple places. All right. So that's just a small brief on projects and apps. Now that you've all got pip installed and now that you've all got Django installed, you should have access to the Django-admin command. So what we'll be doing is that now we're inside a blank folder. Let me open the file explorer here, and let me increase the height of this a little bit so that it's a little more visible to you folks. Let's do Django-admin, start project. And let's give this project a name, small URL. Again, feel free to give the project your own names and your own descriptions. Feel free to customize some details. I will tell you where exactly you need to maintain the exact same notations and notations and names for specific things. Okay. So let's do Django-admin start project small URL. Now that it's run, right, you can see that there's this folder that's popped up in VScode for me. There's another folder inside it. You can see that there's a manage.py file, right? And there's another folder inside it with a bunch of files. So we'll talk about what each of these files are one by one. The server or making changes to the database. So you'll be calling manage.py as the main script whenever you're trying to make changes at these levels. And you'll notice that manage.py is one level above the actual folder. This is what we'll call the main app of our project, right? So the main app of our project contains another bunch of files. Those familiar with Python will know that the underscore underscore init underscore underscore dot py file, right, is just used to signify that this is a Python library. So from different places in the library itself, within the app, our files you don't need to worry about right now. They have to do with how you set up the website. So Django ships with a built-in development server for us to rapidly, check the changes we've made, right? But in production, when you deploy an app like this in actual production, like outside of a hackathon context, maybe, so when you deploy it to the cloud, you'll have to use an actual web server to handle working with the paths you provided, because Django is a web development framework. It's not a web server, right? So these files have specifically to do with how you deal with different types of web servers, but they aren't relevant at the moment. Uh, we'll take a slightly longer look at the settings.py file. Again, all these are files generated by Django in itself, so you don't have to worry too much about creating them on your own. Django will create these and take care of this for you. The settings.py file can be thought of as a single source of truth for many things in your project. All right. So you can see a definition here for the base directory of the project, right? There's a secret key here which you can use for cryptographic functions, which Django does not recommend that you use, right? There's something called allowed hosts, which tells Django that look, there are these things that can make requests to our application. There's a debug flag here. If we turn this to false, Django will stop giving us helpful error messages. And we have mentioned very clearly security warning, don't run with debug turned on in production, because it gives away a lot of information about the app, right? You see this segment called installed apps as well. So we're just telling Django that that these are all the different apps that are installed. So you see Django itself ships with a bunch of built-in apps. So there's a admin app, there's an authentication app, there's a content types app, there's a sessions app, there's a messages app, and there's a static files app. You don't have to worry too much about the file name, because typically when you're developing Django applications, these won't be as relevant to you unless you want to make some pretty significant changes. So don't worry too much about what's there. Just remember that installed apps is a place where we can tell the Django application as to what apps we have installed in our project. All right. Middleware is something which sits between the request and the response of a web application. Middleware can be thought of as a bunch of packages to handle security, right? Mostly security, but middleware handles different functions as well, right? So you have security, you have sessions middleware, you have CSRF view middleware, which stands for cross site request forgery. Again, nothing you need to worry about understanding too in depth right now. I'm just giving you an example of what different things a Django application has, right? You've got authentication middleware, you've got X-frame options middleware. Now we come to this bit called the root URL config. As a part of our web framework, we have to specify where different entities live, right? So let's say you have data of a particular type. How access happens to this data is that you'll usually wire this data to a URL, specific URL, and you can tell people that look, if you go to this URL, you'll get this data, right? So a URL config is essentially just a file that tells the framework where to route each URL that comes. So when you go to www.google.com/home, right, or www.google.com/images, right? So how does that server know that when someone says /images, I have to respond with this particular data, right? So that's the URL configuration. Django has a very easy way of doing URL configuration, which you guys will see in a couple of minutes. And this is just the root URL config. So if you have a project with multiple apps, right, you maybe have a different URL config than the one they set up for you, like a different set of URLs than the ones they set up for you. So you don't have to worry too much about it at this moment. Just know that it's where it points to the first place that URLs will be checked against. Okay. And we've got our settings object explaining templates. Templates are an advanced feature of Django, which allow you to use Django itself to render some HTML and CSS. So don't worry about what's here right now. It's just a bunch of configuration that you don't have to touch at the moment. We'll come to this next segment called databases, where we tell Django how exactly we want it to handle storing the data. Because all your data has to live in one particular place, right? It has to live in a database of some sort. So in this segment of configuration, we're just telling Django what it has to do to interact with the database. This point of time, we've just told it use a SQLite 3 backend. SQLite 3 is a very small, lightweight, single file database. So you of course can configure this to attach to Postgres or MySQL or Cassandra DB or any of the other n different types of databases that are there. But as of right now, and the default configuration that Django recommends you use is SQLite, and you'll see the database file pop up as well. A bunch of things you don't have to worry about: language, time zone, internationalization, localization, time zones, static URLs. Okay, so we're done with the settings.py file at this point. The last thing we have to look in the files that Django generated for us is the urls.py file, right? So you can see a whole bunch of documentation from Django that's there here. We leave this here for now because it tends to be helpful when you're writing your own URLs. But let's focus on these couple of lines, right? Which are the first couple of lines of code within the project. So we have from Django.contrib import admin. So we're importing a module from one of Django's built-in apps. If you remember, contrib was a built-in app, right? And from Django.urls, which is another built-in app, we're importing path. Lastly, tell Django that, look, this is where my configuration for URLs lives. We'll have a URL patterns list declared with a bunch of path objects inside it. So we're just telling Django at this point that, look, it's this easy to declare a URL in Django, right? You say at the admin/path, right? I want you to respond with this function. Okay. So at this point of time, I think we're ready because we've installed Django, right? So we're ready to start essentially running our first web server. We've covered the main app and manage.py. We'll create a new app in a second, but as of right now, let's just run the server. So again, if you want to do an ls command to see which folders are there, you can see that there's now a small URL folder. We can use cd small URL or whatever name you provided it to change directories into that particular directory. And now your shell should tell you that you're in project slash the specific folder that you selected. Let me just take a sip of water. Excellent. So we're in the small URL folder at this point, and your shell should usually tell you that you're in a Python environment. Either way, let's just do an ls-la to list out all the files that are there. And you can see that there's a manage.py file present in the folder. So at this point of time, we're just looking at this particular folder. You can see a manage.py and you can see a directory called small URL, which is good. This is what we want, right? Now, like I told you before, manage.py is our primary interface to all administrative functions in Django, right? We do Python 3 manage.py run server. So Python 3 manage.py run server. So what happens at this point is once we hit this command, Django will spin up a development server for us. This is not a server meant to be used in production deployments, but this is good enough for us to understand exactly how our web app works, right? And for us to get a live demo of things. Well, let's hit enter. It says unknown command run server, spelling mistake. So Python 3 manage.py run server server. I've got it right this time. So let's hit enter. All right. At this point of time, you should see a bunch of messages. It says, we're watching for file system changes with stat reloader, which is the library that they're using internally to check for, essentially to check for what files is being changed, right? It says we're performing some system checks. It says the system check identified 0 issues and there have been no issues that are silenced. Now there's something in red, which is pretty interesting for us. You have 18 unapplied migrations. Your project may not work properly until you apply the migrations for admin, auth, content types, and sessions. If you folks remember, these are inbuilt apps that Django shipped with, right? So these are some apps which fulfill a number of critical functionalities that any large app should have, and we should be able to apply them pretty soon. And you'll understand why this message came up when I cover migrations in a couple of minutes. All right. So it says this is the version of Django using the settings file located here. We started a development server at localhost http colon 127.0.0.1, which is localhost at the port 8000. All right. So let us follow this URL. I'll open a separate window for Firefox. Go localhost colon 8000 and we'll zoom in. So I hope the font size is large enough at this point for it to be visible to you folks. But you can essentially see a page from Django at localhost colon 8000, like they told us to navigate to, right? It says the install worked successfully. Congratulations, and you see this small rocket taking off, animatedly. So it says you're seeing this page because debug is true in your settings file, and you have not configured any URLs, which is true. We haven't configured any URLs at all at this point, right? And we've got debug true. Let's try making debug false within our settings file to see what happens. Let's go here. We'll find our settings.py file. Let's look for debug. Let's see the debug equal to true here. Let's change it to false. I appear to have caps lock on. Let's change it to false. Excellent. And let's save this file once again. It's been saved, right? And we see a bunch of error messages already. It says command error, you must set settings.allowed hosts if debug is false. So let's do that. In allowed hosts, all I'm going to do is I'm going to enter a wildcard star, which says essentially that all URLs are allowed from anywhere. So anyone can visit our web server to see what's going on. Let's do python manage.py run server. We get the same bunch of error messages, but no command error this time because we've allowed requests to come in from all hosts. So we've essentially allowed literally anyone and everyone to query our website. Let's run this. And you can see it says the requested resource was not found on this server, which is your standard 404 page, right? Upon refreshing, this is what we see. Let's go back. Again, this is because we set debug to false, right? So let's keep debug. Let's turn debug back to true. Save the file, and we'll reload the server. You can see it auto reloads whenever you change the settings file or any file for that matter. And once we hit refresh here again, you can see we're back to that friendly looking Django page of ours, which tells us, that your installs work successfully, and you can now move on with developing the rest of your app. Lovely. So we've essentially installed a proper functioning Django install at this point, which means the framework is set up properly for us to develop. And at this point of time onwards, it's on to us to start adding features and URLs to it. Okay. So back to our presentation, the main app in manage.py. The first thing we'll be doing is that we'll be creating a new app. So like I mentioned, an app is a pluggable component in a Django project. Apps are essentially modularized to the point that you can copy paste them between projects and they'll still work, right? So the command's right here. So we'll create an app called URL. Slightly confusing name, but I think it suits the application that's being built. So let's do that. Let's go back here. We can kill our server for a second with Control-C to clear the screen. Let's do a python manage.py start app URLs, or to maybe avoid conflict, we'll say my URLs. Cool. So the command executed without any output, which is a good sign at most points in time. And you can see that there's been another folder that we've created, or that's been created, right? Let's take a slightly deeper look at this. You can see that there's a migration subfolder, which at the moment is empty. There's an init.py file inside, but that's it. We've got an admin.py file. The admin.py file is essentially what we use in Django to register a model with the admin interface that Django ships with. So Django's inbuilt administrative interface is extremely powerful, and it can help you do a lot of things that, to the extent that sometimes people don't even bother adding a separate front end. Django's admin interface is feature rich enough for you to put an app into production with it. So the admin.py file, as you can see here, right? It says register your models here. So Django expects us to register our models with the admin site right here. The apps.py file again is something that is auto-generated by Django for you, right? So you don't exactly have to worry about what it contains, and we usually don't touch the contents of this file either during development. Now you can see that we've got a models.py file which is empty. It says create your models here. There's a test.py file which says create your tests here, and there's a views.py file which says create your views here, right? So each of these files imports a different library or a different bunch of functionalities from throughout the Django standard library, and we'll talk more about these in a second. So now that we've created a new app, the first thing we'll be doing is we'll be adding the app to the settings, because Django has to know that once we've installed an app, right, or that once we're working on an app, Django has to know that, look, there are some resources of this app that I have to keep taking a look at, right? I need to keep taking a look at the models inside this app. I need to keep taking a look at the URL configs inside this app. How will Django know, right? Because at this point of time, it's just another folder with a bunch of Python files created inside. So how we solve this problem is by going to our main app, which is small URL at this point. We go to settings.py. We find the installed apps segment, right? And once all these apps are done, we'll go to the next line and we'll say my URLs. And we'll add a comma to save ourselves some time when we're adding the next step. So all I've done is I've gone to line 40 at this point, and I've added my URLs, the app name. So whatever the name was that we used when we created the new app with Django, which was Django Python 3 manage.py start app, the app name, whatever name we use, we'll use the same name here. So we've got my underscore URLs right here as the name of the app that we have. So formally, what you should be doing, or ideally what what recommended practice is, right, is you do my URLs dot apps dot whatever's there in the apps file, my URLs config, right, URLs config. But in practice, you don't have to do this. Your app will work fine either way. So just to prove to you that it'll work fine either way, let me go to the terminal right here. We'll run our Python 3 manage.py run server command again, right? So it says, you have 18 unapplied migrations. Your project may not work properly until you apply these migrations, right? So there's no error, because if we mess up this app definition, right? So let's say I remove the first character randomly, right? So there's no such app that exists. You'll see a bunch of error messages that say, module not found error. There's no module named YURLs. So I'm just trying to prove to you that this isn't just working by default. What I've actually entered here is correct. Under my URLs.apps.myurls config, it works. The server's starting, which means it's a good sign. We can go ahead at this point. But usually what you'll do is you will usually go ahead and keep just the app name. So even just my URLs is fine. But so long as it is the app name indeed. So you've got my URLs here, right, which is the new app that we generated. So long as you use this name itself, your installed apps configuration should be fine. So you don't have to worry about it. Right, so now that we've added our app to the settings, we can register the new app with the admin site, right? But before that, what we'll do is we will go ahead and define our models. So like we discussed before, right, models are essentially how we'll describe the data that we have in our application. We'll go ahead and open up our models.py file here. Now, the syntax for declaring a new model is that models are declared as Python objects, inherited Python objects. So every model is technically a class, right? We'll do class my short URL model, right? And we'll inherit from models.model. The inheritance bit is standard. It is a prerequisite for a Python object to be recognized as a Django model, right? And will not work without that. So this word here can be any name you want to provide. But this bit inside the brackets here is compulsory. It has to be the absolute same as models.model, right? Your app will not work if not for that. So now that we've got our class, right, we can just leave a comment here saying this is the model for a short URL, right? So a helpful comment here for whoever comes to read our code later. So we can say this is the model for a short URL. Now, how exactly do you declare model fields in Django? Right. So whenever you have an SQL database, you have a bunch of tables, and each table has a bunch of columns, right? So you have an ID column, you have a name column, let's say you have an age column, you have an address column. This is how you look at things in a relational perspective. So how do you do it in Django? How exactly you do it in Django is you use model fields. So let's just write that in a comment. You shall use model fields to add data with a model. All right. Now, exactly how we're going to do this is the first thing we're going to do, because we're trying to create a short URL, right? So what we want to do is we want the long URL itself, and we want whatever shortcut we'll be using to identify that URL. So let's say I want my URL shortener to take me to youtube.com whenever I hit ABC, or to take me to google.com whenever I hit ABC as the shortcut for the URL, right? So if that's the case, at the very least, right, we'll have to store two things, which is the shortcut that we're using to access these long URLs, and the long URLs themselves, right? So that we know what exactly it is we are trying to access. So let's do this. Let's say short, let's call it a lead or a slug, whatever you want. Let's call it a lead. So we'll say lead equals to models dot character field, and each field has a whole bunch of properties you can set, right? So a character field can be it can be a primary key, it can have a maximum length, it can be unique, it can be blank, it can be null. So what I'd really suggest is that you go over here and you go to the Django reference here, right? So let's just Google that, the Django project. So this is the website of the Django project. You will often find it a good idea to essentially go to the Django website and look at documentation here, where they'll explain a whole bunch of things from scratch. Let's zoom in a little bit. They'll explain a whole bunch of things from scratch, such as how to install requests and responses, models in the admin site. So this is an excellent place to refer to, even if you're doing development work while you're in the middle of working. So let's take a small look at the reference for character field. Let's just type in search character field. We have a model field reference page, right? At this point of time, it seems like a bunch of scary stuff, but don't worry. The more you use it, the easier life gets with Django. So at the reference here, let me just zoom in. You can see it says class character field max length is equal to none. It says a string field for small to large size strings. Now Django has a whole bunch of fields like this, right? You can see that we've got you've got a big integer field, you've got a binary field, you've got a date field, you've got a date time field, you've got a decimal field, you've got a duration field. There are an entire bunch of fields that you can have here, right? And you'll see us using a URL field as well once we start once we start taking in the data for this particular app. All right. So again, how we declare a specific field on a model is we say, this name can be arbitrary. Just remember that you'll have to reference it whenever you look for member objects in a model. So let's say lead is equal to models.character field, and let's provide a max length of, let's say we want this to be valid for, or we want really short URLs. So let's say we give it a maximum length of 4. So the idea at this point is that our sample URL should look like localhost :8000 or our domain name. But all right, fine, let's do this. So let's say our sample URL should look like domain name /s or /u, whatever, something small, /4 variable characters. That can be anything. So let's say we've got a lifespan of 10,000 URLs on this URL shortener. Obviously, there are different ways to ensure that these things will be allocated uniquely. But as of right now, we'll just be manually allocating different leads to each specific URL we want to shorten. Okay. So we say, a lead is a character field, right? That has a maximum length of 4. That's how you should read it. A lead is a character field that has a maximum length of 4. And once we're done with this, we'll also start creating our, we'll also have to store the URL to redirect to. So let's call this the endpoint, right? Is equal to models dot URL field, right? This is how simple it is to define a data model in Django, right? You didn't have to touch SQL, you didn't have to touch any sort of declarative language. Everything gets done through Python objects in itself. Okay. So now we've got our model ready in our models.py file, and it's a very small, simple model, right? You'll agree with me when I tell you that it's an extremely small and simple model. So you don't have to worry too much about what it is. But at this point of time, what we'll have to do is we'll have to register the new app with the admin site. So like I told you, admin site is a very powerful utility that Django has, and I'll show it to you in a second. But essentially, what we'll need to do is inside the new app that we created, we'll have to go to admin.py, right? We'll have to go to the top. We'll say from dot models, standard Python syntax to import something from another file that's there in the same directory. Say from dot models, import my short URL model, right? So we're importing the model here, all right? And standard procedure at this point is to call admin.site.register on this model, so that the admin site knows that there's a model called my short URL model, and should prepare its functionality for that as well. We do admin.site, site.register, my short URL model. Lovely. So we save it, our development server refreshes since we've had it running all this time, and it has no errors, which means we're good to go, right? Now that we have, now that we've got our changes declared in our Python file in terms of our data model, okay, what we should be able to do is we should be able to reflect these changes in the database, right? So we'll be interacting with the database for the duration of our web app building. And at this point in time, the database being looked at here is a db.sqlite3 file, which is just a giant binary file. So you don't have to worry too much about it now. Just know that it could be the case that this file doesn't exist and you're connecting to a database somewhere on someone's server or on your own network, right? So there are endless possibilities in terms of how you can use Django to connect to a database, but nothing you need to particularly worry about right now. All right, excellent. So we've registered our model with the admin site right now. Okay. What's a migration? When we talk about having changes made to the data model itself, right? We need to apply these changes to the database. But databases don't interact in Python. Databases interact in SQL, right? So we need something to sit and do, the conversion between the changes we're making in Python and the specific SQL commands for those changes as well. So that's what a migration is. A migration is essentially Django's way of saying, I know you've made these changes to the model, right? I want to, look at these changes and I want to create some SQL that will work on the database to apply these changes from the previous state of the models you had to the current state of models you have right now, right? So let's run this command, python3 manage.py make migrations. So make migrations is a command that essentially tries to tries to reconcile the differences between two versions of your data model, and it will create the appropriate SQL. Okay, so let's go back to our terminal here. Right, we'll kill the development server for a minute and we'll clear our terminal. We'll say python3 manage.py make migrations. All right. So now it says migrations for my URLs. So no, it knows what changes we've exactly made, right? So so at my URLs slash migration slash this file, 001 underscore initial.py, you can see there's a bunch of, it's a file generated by Django where it declares a migration object. There are libraries going on under the hood at Django that take this and convert it into actual SQL code, right? And you can see that we're just declaring a bunch of fields, with a bunch of parameters here that you don't have to worry about at the moment. I'm just trying to give you a look at what's going on when you do python manage.py make migrations, right? So I believe there's another command which you can use to look at the exact SQL that's generated as well. So if you aren't convinced, let's do this. python3 manage.py SQL migrate. Right, SQL migrate. We need to provide it with an app label. So let's say my URLs 001. Okay. So you use Python 3 manage.py SQL migrate, provide the app name and the migration name, which was 0001 for us, right? It says created model, short model, and you can see that there's actual SQL code here. So for those of you familiar with what SQL looks like, this is a perfectly valid SQL query to create a table, right? So you're saying create a table called my URL short URL model. So the app name, table name. This is an actual valid SQL query that Django is going to run against the database. But we don't have to worry about this right now. All right. So now that we've made our migrations and Django knows which changes to make, it's a simple matter of applying these changes. So we'll go ahead, we'll do Python 3 manage.py migrate. And now that you run this, you should see like a flurry of output on your screen. Let's just take a second to look at what's going on, right? So it says there are operations to perform. So we're applying all migrations on some of the inbuilt apps that came with Django. You have admin, you have auth, you have content types, you have my URLs and sessions. These are all the names of different migrations that each app has generated on its own. And you can see our migration here to my underscore URLs dot 0001 underscore initial. It says running migrations, where it's taking the SQL queries generated by each of these migrations and it's running them against our database. So now our database has a bunch of content within it to to ensure that we'll be able to work on this application smoothly. So we have our terminal here, right? And if I'm not wrong, we can close this. So we have our terminal here where it appears to, yeah, we've got our terminal here where you can see that the migrations have been run. So if there was an error, your migrations Python 3 manage.py migrate command would have failed. So it wouldn't have worked, but it looks like our changes to our model are in order. So we've done these migrations right now, right? And all we need to do is we can now, take a look at running the server again. We shouldn't get those error messages that says, you have unapplied migrations. Do Python 3 manage.py run server. And you see there are no error messages from Django this time. So which means that all the basic functionality that Django ships with, we've got it enabled because we've applied migrations. So some people might apply the migrations immediately, some people might take their time, so it's up to you. It's usually preferable to apply migrations after you've made your user model, but that's not something we'll get into right now because it's outside the scope of this talk. Okay, so we've got our server running again. Let's refresh the page. It says the install worked successfully, all good. Our model is registered now. And we've registered our model with the admin site as well. So let's go here. Let's go to localhost :8000 and we shall go to /admin. It is the, that's the place where Django's admin site lives. So you see a prompt asking us for username and password. But this is strange because we haven't created any sort of username or password to, run this app. So what we'll have to do is we'll have to create a super user. So a super user in a Django app is someone who has full control over the databases, the data in itself, hosting the app. Ideally, that's you. That should be the developer of the app, but sometimes it might not be. And Django supports that too. But as of now, we'll operate under the assumption that the super user is just you. So it essentially allows us to set up a giant, massive authentication module where it says that if it's only you making these changes, it's good, but no one else is allowed to make changes to this. With Python 3 manage.py create super user. It's asking me for a username, which I'm going to leave blank because I want to use my name. Email address I'm going to leave blank. Put in a small password. Do it again. This password is too short. Must contain at least 8 alphanumeric characters. You can bypass password validation for super users whenever you're creating it through a command line. Go ahead. Okay, so now it says super user created successfully. All right, let's run the server again, and you can see no issues, so we're good. Let's go back to this website. Let's keep the username that we selected, and let's take the password we selected as well, and we can hit login. This point of time, you can see a nice site that says Django administration, right? There's welcome Anirudh. You can view the site, you can change the password, you can log out. And say my URLs here, which is our app. It says models in the my URLs application as well. So let's click on this, right? And it says underscore my URLs. You have my short URL model. So what we can do at this point is that we can continue to do CRUD operations on our data from within Django's administrative interface as well. You can use it directly, which is why I mentioned that sometimes companies don't ship their own front end with their Django apps. They use the admin interface in itself, which is again extensively customizable, so you don't have to worry about it. So now we'll hit add, right? And as you guys can see, based on the data model that we declared in our models.py file, right, where we said models, the lead field is a character field, right, and the endpoint is the URL field. You can see that the settings app is nice enough to keep these constraints in mind for us, right? And I'm trying to type more characters, but it isn't letting me get more than 4 characters. So the admin interface is very tightly integrated to the application itself. Let's say my lead is ABCD and my endpoint is https www.google.com, right? And through this in itself, you can save and continue editing, you can save and add another, or you can save in itself. So let's say save and add another, right? It gives us a message saying the my short URL model, this object was added successfully. You may add another short URL below. So at this point, you've just made your successful first interaction with your database, and you've managed to create an object that lives in your database now that's accessible through Django. All right. So once we go back here, right, you can see that it's showing up here under my short URL model object 1, right? But how about this, right? This is pretty difficult to read and it doesn't tell us anything about what the object is. So what we'll do is we'll override a method on this model. So you must be familiar with the __str method in Python, which decides what is outputted when an object is printed. So let's do that. Def str. We'll accept self as an argument, right? And we'll say we'll return a formatted string. We'll say upon returning this formatted string, we'll say, just move back to my terminal here. Yeah. So upon returning this formatted string, we wanted to have the details about self.lead, right? Which we'll say it leads to self.endpoint. Lovely. So now that we've saved this in the model file, right, this method should have been overridden here. So now you can see that it says ABCD leads to www.google.com. So at this point of time, we have one object ready here. We can delete it if we want, right? You can say, yes, I'm sure. We'll delete it. We'll add one more. So ABCD leads us to www.google.com. Again, I'm just showing you an example of how you can create and delete an object. We'll save it. Let's say I changed my mind, right? I want to edit this object. So we can click on it. We can edit whatever it is. We can say DEFG could be our lead, right? And we'll save it. So these changes get reflected in the database as and when you continue making these changes in the admin interface, which is why Django's admin interface is really powerful. Okay, so we've got our model ready at this point, and I've shown you how you can do create, reads, updates, and deletes using the admin side. And I've also shown you how you can have human readable names for the objects there. So at this point of time, what we'll do is we'll write our first view. So you would have noticed that there's a views.py file here within the project in itself, right? It says from Django.shortcuts import render. Just to wire this up and make it a little fun, what we'll do is we'll say from Django.http import HTTP response. So we can provide a direct HTTP response. A view in Django is just a function that helps you, decide a specific way of responding to any request that comes in, right? So let's define a function. Say def my first view. It's a function that takes in something called a request parameter, which again is something that's provided by Django, so you don't have to worry about it right now. So we say my first view request, and we can say return HTTP response, and we can just pass in any string we want to return it. We say hello, right? So this is our first view that we've written. Now we have defined a way of handling incoming requests, right? So in this function, right, you say whenever there's a request, I want you to give them an HTTP response of hello. But how does our server know that, whenever someone comes to this URL, we want to give them a hello request, right? Or we want to give them a response that says hello. So what we'll do to solve this is we'll declare our URLs here. So you would have noticed in the small URL main app itself, there's a urls.py file. And you can see that, it says for the path of admin, we want you to call this function. So we'll do something very similar in our my URLs app itself. So we'll open a new file called urls.py. We can shamelessly copy paste everything inside this because we'll be reusing most of it and the documentation is useful to read. So it's a copy, come back and we'll paste it here. Okay. So it says, it's just a bunch of notes on the URL configuration in itself. It says, we list routes URLs to views, right? So you can add function views, which we're dealing with right now. So it says, so we have to add an import. The first thing we have to do is import our function from this to the URLs file. And we want to add a URL to our URL patterns. So we have a path descriptor here. We can point it to a specific view and we can give it a name if we want as well. All right, so we'll remove this line because we don't need the admin site anymore. And we'll say path, right? At the moment, we'll use a slightly special constructor. We'll say string, we'll say str colon, and we'll give this, bit a name. We'll say lead, right? And we'll give it a trailing backslash. And from our views, right? So we want to attach a function to respond to this URL. So we'll say from dot views, this is standard Python syntax, import, the view was called my first view, right? So let's go here from dot views, import my first view. So now we have this function. It's a simple matter of just telling Django that we want this to point to our function here to respond. Say my first view. All right. So now we have a URL patterns object ready here to to tell Django that we want to respond with this at this point. But there's one small thing missing. We have our URLs declared here, but our main app does not know of our URL that's located here. Right. So we go to the urls.py file, right? And we'll add another import here. Say from django.urls import paths, include. You'll understand why in a second. So you usually have one app at the top and you have a bunch of smaller sub apps, right? Which Django uses to organize, to separate data, to separate models, to have a separation of concerns established, essentially, right? So we want to do the same thing, but it's very tedious for us to, take every single function that's there and import it into the top level urls.py file in some other app and, assign it to a specific URL. So Django is usually able to handle recursive URL definitions. So if you tell Django that, look, past this point, I want you to refer to this app's URL configuration itself to handle URLs coming in from here, Django is capable of doing that, right? We'll say path, and because, we want to have our short URLs, we'll say s/, right, as the URL prefix, and we'll say include, right? We call the function here, and our app's name is my underscore URLs. So we'll do my underscore URLs dot URLs because the urls.py file is where it's located. And for good measure, let's add a comma to the end of this, right? So we appear to have an error. Okay, it says improperly configured URL route str lead cannot contain white space inside angle brackets. Good, fair point. So let's go back to the urls.py file here and see there's a space here which is causing the issue. So we'll save it and hopefully we should be able to restart the server. And the server runs with no issues. So it was a stray white space that was messing things up for us. But our urls.py file has now been configured to look at my URLs, the URLs defined in my URLs app inside this file, to direct all URLs coming with the prefix s, right? So now we have a server ready and we have a path ready as well. So if you look at this, it says this particular pattern, str lead, will respond with the my first view option. So at this point, since we aren't checking for anything, we might as well just go and test it out. So let's go to localhost 8000. All right. So the first thing you see when you go to localhost colon 8000 is it says page not found, right? And it gives you a bunch of information about the request method and the request URL as well. So it tells us that using the URL configuration defined in small URLs, Django tried these URL patterns in this order. The admin path is not something we requested for, which is why it did not direct us there. And it says S, right? So it says the empty path didn't match any of these, which is true. So let's change this path. Let's make it /s, right? So now that we're in here, you can see that our URL definition in the small URLs or my URLs file has now been updated, because Django now knows that there's another type of URL definition. So back when we were here, right, it said it's just S, but now when we visited localhost colon 8000/s, right, Django is telling us, look, I know you defined something with a string type of lead here, right, which didn't match any of this. So you have to change your URL to get a valid response. So why we did string lead here is we want to be able to accept anything that comes in the URL itself. So at the moment, if I want to, I can just say hello. Right? I can make it a static URL definition. So if I go to /s/hello, right, you'll see the response from the server here, right, which says hello, which is great. So we've established our first request response cycle here. The request response cycle is what happens in Django when you say, whenever I get a request, I want you to respond this way. So informally, this is known as the request response cycle. All right. So here's our first, essentially just congratulate yourself at this point because you've set up your first request response cycle. But this isn't the app in itself, right? We want to make it dynamic and we want to make it match each URL we want to make it match each URL that comes in here to a specific object that we've defined in our database, right? So we'll get to that. But, let's go back to, the string lead that we had here before, right? Which is a wildcard to tell Django that inside this URL, I want you to accept any lead, which is any strings that are there of the type lead, right? So let's try refreshing with the same URL. It says type error at /s/hello. It says my first view got an unexpected argument lead. So whenever you're defining your URL arguments like this with a variable type URL argument, so you can say a wildcard essentially. You can say whenever there's a string type that I want to call lead, right? Whenever there's something like this, your view function has to accept an additional argument or additional arguments based on how many wildcard characters you define here. So let's go back to our app, the views.py file here. So after request, we'll make it take in a lead argument. All right. So now that this is done, our server auto refreshes and we're back here. Let's hit a refresh. It says hello. This is lovely. So now we can type anything in here instead of hello. Say ABCD, right? Or DCEF, right? Or anything literally that you want. You can say hello again, right? And it'll give us the same response. So how do we know that each page being responded, each response that you get is unique, right? So we have our lead object here. So let's print that. Let's print whatever we get in lead as and when the functions hit. I'll open the terminal a little bit more here. Let's refresh on this page, which should submit a request with the lead of hello. And as you can see, hello has been printed out here. So we can, through this, we can see what URL parameters are being sent. All right. So let's do this. Let's return an HTTP response to the formatted string. And we say lead, or we can say lead is followed by this lead here, right? The server refreshes. There are no errors here. We can refresh. It says hello, lead is hello. If I go to ABCD here, it says hello, lead is ABCD. If I go to DCEF here, or anything really. So if I say hi, bye, whatever, it's reflected right here. So now let's come back to the request object. The request object is essentially what contains a whole bunch of information about the request you're making. So what HTTP type is it? What body came with that request? If it was a post request, if it was a get request, what parameters were there? Not something you need to worry about right now, right? But this is essentially what the request object is. It provides you with a whole bunch of information about anything associated with the request. So if you want to, let's just print it. Let's print the request object so you can see what's going on behind the hood, right? So let's hit our URL again. So it says this is the string representation of the object. It says it's a GET request, and it gives us the path here as well. There's a whole bunch of information such as the request method, the request body, all that stuff you can access through the request, and you can refer to the Django documentation for to understand exactly what all you can access through that request. All right. So lastly, again, we've done registering our view with the URLs. What we'll do at this point is, instead of going to templates, let me just show you how you can pull data from your database to respond to any request that's coming in at this point. Okay, so what we're going to do is, in Django, how you interact with your models or your code within the code base itself. So like, say you have a view function that wants to pull some data from a specific table in the database, right? As you often might, because your views contain your business logic in the MVC framework. So your views will often have to interact with your database to create objects or delete objects, right? So what we'll do here is we'll import the model. So we'll say from .models import my short URL model, which is the name of the model we had. And so you can access all the objects under my short URL model through this, right? So let's declare a variable called objects. We'll say objects equal to my short URL model dot objects dot all, right? So this syntax is essentially used by us to tell Django to pull all the objects under this model, under this table, which is the advantage that you have with a web framework like this, right? You don't have to write a single line of SQL. Every interaction that you have with data can be done through Python itself, so you don't have to touch the SQL at all, right? Say my short URL model dot objects dot all, and let's print this just to see what's going on. Print objects. Save this, right? Now every single time we get a request here, it should print all the objects in the database. It says it's a query set type that we see in the response here. It says my short URL model, and you can see the string representation for each model we defined. So let's go define one more. All right, let's go back to our admin panel here. Let's add one more. So let's say the lead is ABCD. Let's make the endpoint news.google.com, right? https://news.google.com. We'll save it, and you can see there's another object declared here, right? With news.google.com, we have google.com itself, and let's create another object, just to have some data to test based off of. We'll say our lead is WXYZ. Let's say the endpoint for this is, again, localhost : or actually, let's just say this is images.google.com. So again, we're editing this through our interface right now, but you can ideally set up another web page to handle the editing and changing of these things as well. So Django will allow you to do that on your own. You can save it. Now we have 3 different sample URLs, with their shortened representations in our database. And you can see that in the meantime, our web server is showing so much activity because we've been making different requests to the web server in itself, trying to get these changes added to our database. What we'll do right now is we'll go to this page and we'll refresh. As we've seen before, all the URLs, the representation of all the URLs that were there will show up here. Let's say my short URL model, a DFG leads to google.com, ABCD leads to news.google.com, right? A WXYZ leads to images.google.com. So we've got all these objects here. And we also have the lead, right? So now what we want to do ideally is we want to pull the first object from the database where the lead in that database matches the lead we've got as part of the URL. And let's say we'll show which URL this leads to. All right. So we'll have the advantage of using objects.all, right, is that there are different types of aggregation queries you can run on these objects. right? So instead of objects.all, you can use objects.get, which is a specific way of pulling based on different criteria that each model has. And Django's filtering system in itself is very advanced as well. So you can combine multiple types of filters, aggregations, and so on to get the right combination of objects you need to be able to run your business logic, right? So at this point of time, all we'll say is get. What I want to do is I want to find the first entry in the database where the lead, or what I've defined to be the lead here, where the lead is equal to the lead that someone's given us in the URL, right? Let's say lead equal to lead, or we can change the name for this. We can say user lead, right? And say lead is equal to user underscore lead here. So all this is telling Django is, look, of all the objects that my short URL model has, get me the object where the lead field is equal to user lead, right? And in this print statement as well, we can change that user underscore lead, right? And you can see that it says no issues with our server again. So let's try hitting this site at another point of time. It says my first view got an unexpected keyword argument lead, which is true because we specified the name of this argument as lead in our URL config, right? So we can rename this user underscore lead, save it. Our server reloads with no issues. Let's run it. So it says does not exist at /s/hi, which is true because as per our data here, right, we don't have any hi defined right here. So let's use one of the existing URLs that are there. Let's say wxyz, right? /s/wxyz. It says hello, the lead is wxyz. But what would be really cool is if we could show the user the URL that specific lead is pointing to, right? So when we say objects, when we assign the result of this query to objects, we can also print objects to see what's going on. We print objects, right? Let's refresh this page again with a valid lead. So at this point of time, you can see that the object has been printed. That's wxyz leads to https images.google.com. And you can also, at this point of time, instead of just saying user lead, let's say we want to show them that the lead is this and the URL pointed to, and we can say objects dot long URL, right? Because that's what we defined it in our model endpoint. That's dot endpoint. Cool. So we've got this, right? So every time you refresh with a valid lead, it says the lead is wxyz and the URL pointed to is http://images.google.com. Just to demonstrate, that changes will be possible through the admin interface very easily. You can see that wxyz currently points to an HTTP URL, not an HTTPS URL, and that's reflected here, right? So let's go to the admin interface. Let's open this. We can modify it, right? So let's just add an S here and we can save it. There's the my short URL model. This was changed successfully. So now when we go back here, right, and keep in mind we haven't had to reload the server at all. Once we refresh it, you can see that the URL change has been reflected directly here, right? But what if someone provides us with the wrong URL, right, or the wrong lead, or a lead we don't have? We don't want the application to crash at that point, right? So let's say something random here that says does not exist. This is a pretty ugly response. We don't want this, right as it may be. So what we'll say is we'll use Python exceptions. You can see that the error says does not exist error that's getting raised here. See, it says it's the exception type is does not exist. So we can use a simple try catch block to handle this. So we'll say try the objects collected here, and we'll say except. And since we don't really want to accept any specific type of error because we want it to be a wildcard response for any wrong URL, all right, we're just leaving the except blank here. We'll say put this here. We can shamelessly copy paste at this point. So we'll just return an HTTP response that says the URL the lead does not exist. We'll save this, right? Our server reboot successfully, all good. Let's go to this faulty URL again. It says the lead does not exist instead of crashing the application, which is good. And if we go back to WXYZ, right, it says the lead is WXYZ and the URL pointed to is https://images.google.com. Okay. So now we've got this response here, but how do we actually, go ahead and get this to, push the user to that site, right? So from Django.shortcuts, we can import render, we can import a whole bunch of objects here. But what we'll do is we'll create a small template that uses a tiny bit of JavaScript to send these people back to that page. So under my URLs, which is our app, we can really close everything else. We can create a new folder that says templates. And under this folder, we can create a new folder that's my URLs. It's not necessary to do this strictly, but it's good practice because your templates can live under different namespaces, so to say, right? And what we'll do is we'll create a new file called index.html here. So you can see it's an empty HTML file. We can use whatever snippet completion engine you have to add a blank title here, right? At this point of time, what we'll say is within this, we'll add a pair of double curly braces. And Django templates are a very powerful feature, but not one that we unfortunately had the time to explore at this point in time. So I'd suggest that everyone check out the reference for that. So we've got, it's a standard HTML file, but the advantage for this is that we can essentially continue using our, we can pass data from Django into our templates. So we can render them as full web pages, right? So let's say our redirect URL is a parameter that we want to have rendered within our body, right? Now that we've just created this file under templates/myurl/index.html, we can go to views.py, and instead of returning an HTTP response, right, we can say return render, right? And render asks for the request object which we're taking in, so we'll pass that in. Return render request, and it's asking for the template name, which is my URL/index.html, and we can pass a blank object here. All right, so it renders, right? We might see a bunch of small, okay, so there are no errors right here, which is good. Let's go back here, but you can see the page blanking out. And why is that really? Why is that, despite the fact that in our templates we've specified, under index.html, we've said we want a redirect URL object here. So it's a being redirected to this redirect URL. So let's render this again. It says being redirected to blank, just because it cannot find what redirect URL is, given that we haven't passed it, right? So you can pass data from the view to the template using a dictionary. We'll call the key redirect URL, and the value for this will be objs.endpoint, right? Because that's where our long URL is stored. We'll go back here. At WXYZ, it tells us being redirected to https://images.google.com, right? But for anything else, it will give us our standard HTTP response. This says the lead does not exist. Let's go back to a valid page here, right? So now that we're in this HTML file, what we can do is we can open a script tag for JavaScript, right? And we can say window.location is equal to, and we can again pull this variable directly, say redirect URL. Right? So this should ideally be rendered directly into the file. So we should be able to, let's try doing a console.log. Should be able to console.log the redirect URL directly as it gets rendered as a static blob of text. We'll save this file here. Let's go back. Let's open our developer console here. And let's refresh. There's uncaught syntax error, missing bunch of things after the argument list, right? So when it comes to interpolating with JavaScript, we need to be a little careful because there's data that's being passed around, and this template syntax isn't exactly quite forgiving. So at this point of time, we'll just have to settle for this being the redirect URL. It's just telling us that it will throw us to the redirect URL. So upon visiting a valid URL, it says being redirected https://images.google.com. And if I'm not wrong, somewhere within the views itself, instead of having to throw them to a template, you can also do, you can return a response. If I'm not wrong, there's a separate library to redirect. HTTP redirect. Yeah, so an HTTP response redirect, right? So instead of having to render the entire template to get them to do that, you can just do a return HTTP response redirect, right? And you can redirect them to the objects.endpoint. So it turns out you don't have to open the templates at all, but I did demonstrate that because it's a very useful feature. So again, you can exchange data between your HTML and your backend directly whenever that page gets rendered. So you don't have to worry too much about fetching data in that sense. But then again, this isn't always the recommended approach. If you're doing your app entirely with Django, then it's completely fine. But you'll usually use a separate front-end framework as well to handle this kind of data interpolation, right? So our server rebooted as in when we saved the file. Okay, now this should work directly. So yeah, so let's go to localhost :8000 /s/wxyz, right? And upon visiting here, it throws us directly back to images.google.com. Just to prove it to you, let me open this again. Localhost :8000 /s/wxyz, right? We enter this URL. It takes us directly back to images.google.com. So if you've been coding along with me all this time, congratulations, you've built your first URL shortener, albeit a very scrappy one because you've thrown it together last minute, but a working URL shortener nonetheless, right? And I hope this has given you enough knowledge of Django at this point to have some confidence that you'll be able to build your own projects after this using Django. So the advantage is that Django's ecosystem is very supportive, very friendly. Their documentation's top grade, wherein you can really take a look at a lot of the things that Django supports in depth. And say if you want to, let's just test it once again. Let's say ABCD, right? So let's open a new tab. Go to localhost :8000 /s/abcd, and it redirects us back to Google News as expected, right? And lastly, we'll test out, DEFG, which redirects us to Google. So let's close this tab. Let's open a new one. Localhost :8000 /s/abcd, which is taking us to Google News. We were looking at DEFG, right? So localhost :8000 /DEFG is not found because we need to add a /s DEFG, and it takes us directly back to google.com. So congratulations, you've essentially built your first URL shortener. I hope this tutorial gave you enough confidence with Django, especially like at least a working understanding of what goes on inside Django. So you have more time to clarify and look at what's really going on under the hood, so you can build your own apps. And yeah, so thank you folks so much for attending this small workshop. I hope it was as fun for you guys to implement and understand as it was for me to come up with this workshop. And I had a great amount of fun conducting it. So again, the presentation, just a tad bit left, creating templates, which we've covered, final JavaScript redirects. So at this point of time, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you to inGenius for giving me this opportunity to conduct this workshop, which I'm very honored to have. And thank you folks for tuning along and, taking part in this workshop with me. So yeah, thank you folks for attending. We'll see you guys next time. I'm Anirudh Rowjee signing off.